flock of birds.
I was a Catholic. I was deeply religious. I wanted nothing more than to know God and His creation as adequately as my feeble 3.5 pounds of brain would allow for. I started my journey not through skepticism of my faith, but through sheer curiosity and worship. I had always found it disgusting that the very men and women who I preached to knew only a sliver of what I did. It seemed to me that they were content in going to church on Sundays and never contemplating the greater mysteries of God's universe. Ever since I was a child, I had a deep fascination with science. This is something I will forever thank my parents and grandparents for. I was given the opportunity to grow up in a safe neighborhood where I could spend my days inspecting ants in a microscope given to me by my grandparents on my father's side. I could take my telescope out on starry nights and view the moon with my siblings. I could read the countless science books given to me by my parents about topics that ranged from human anatomy to space travel. I would go to bed at night under the glow of the stars on my ceiling and the sun in the center of my toy of the solar system that my father and I had painted. I was raised knowing that I was loved and always told how smart I was. This allowed me to nurture a strong confidence that I have to this very day. This confidence in myself and my love of science allowed me to think critically of many things. I remember well the day my parents told me that Santa Claus didn't exist, that it was only them who placed presents under the tree, that it wasn't Santa who made boot prints outside my bedroom window in the snow on Christmas Eve, but my loving uncle trying to help us kids have a more magical day. My parents gave me a bell one Christmas Day after presents that was akin to the Polar Express bell given to the main character by Santa Claus. This bell still rings for those who truly believe. I was told that it was okay to be upset, but that Santa Claus will forever exist inside of my heart. I remember laughing and saying to them, "Do you really think I'm this stupid to believe a fat man flies around the world with magical reindeer and delivers presents to everyone in one night?" They seemed openly relieved. My father was barely able to hold back his tears, but he could put a smile on his face in moments like this. We hugged and I went downstairs to play with my new presents. I remember sitting in the basement, alone and slowly crying. I'd been struggling with this belief for a long time. Every part of my being wanted Santa Claus to be real. I had to put on a facade to my parents so I would not appear weak, but I knew deep down I didn't believe well before they ever contemplated telling me. Something just didn't stick. I knew that through my reasoning and scientific understanding of the world, that science was incompatible with this view of magic. Santa Claus was a wonderful figure in our imagination that represented kindness, hope, joy, justice, and everything else we could imagine or want. The issue with this is that these things rarely exist in the real world. This is exactly why Santa Claus was invented. He was to fill the void in our collective hearts. Long before I was told Santa Claus didn't exist, I was having doubts of my own on something that would later come to mean more to me than Santa Claus ever would. But to understand this, you have to understand my upbringing.
How can they talk about Santa Claus when there's so much unhappiness in the world?
Poor, misguided folks. They missed the whole point. Lots of unhappiness? Maybe so. But doesn't Santa take a little bit of that unhappiness away? Doesn't a smile on Christmas morning scratch out a tear cried on a Saturday? Not much, maybe. But what would happen if we all tried to be like Santa and learned to give, as only he can give, of ourselves, our talents, our love, and our hearts? Maybe if we could all learn Santa's beautiful lesson, maybe there would finally be peace on earth and goodwill toward man.
I was raised Catholic by my parents. As they say, there are no Catholic children, just children of Catholic parents. This may be true for the majority of children, but it was far from the truth with me. I was extremely active in the church. It was never a chore for me to go to Mass. I could even be found sometimes in the prayer room of the church alone at night. I prayed the rosary, I read the Bible, I even honestly wanted to become a priest for a very long time. I was an altar boy who felt it was an honor to be able to work so closely to the priests. Everyone who knew me, both within the church and outside of it, knew God was working on me to become a fisher of men. Once I had my confirmation, which is a time in a Catholic's life they go through a series of tests and rituals to become recognized Catholics within the church, I became even more involved. I volunteered to become a Eucharistic minister and a reader of the Gospels. This meant I would be the one walking down the aisle in a procession at the beginning of church. I would get up to the marble podium and read the Word of God in front of hundreds of Catholics at a time. I volunteered with my mother as many times as we could. Once the readings were done, I would stand in front of the altar and receive my communion. Catholics believe the communion is the actual body and blood of Christ, before anybody else. I would then distribute the body and blood to a line of Catholics. I felt as if I was literally the middleman between God Himself and the people. This was always a humbling experience. It was honestly one of the things I was the most proud of about myself. One day in Mass, I was not scheduled to read or to be the Eucharistic minister, so I was standing in the back of the church without a seat to be found. When it came time to kneel, I got down on my knees on the hard marble in my best suit and prayed. Everyone else was standing because the ground was too hard. I couldn't care less. I was there to give glory to the Lord, and nothing would stop me from doing so. A man noticed me who would change the way I look at things forever. He was with the Knights of Columbus and wanted to talk to me after Mass. We met, and he got me thinking that I should join. Not too long after that meeting, my father and I joined the Knights of Columbus, and I quickly became a third-degree knight. Even through all of this, I would have to say that the man who inspired me the most was a younger priest who moved to our church for several years. It was an honor to stand alongside him during Mass and to have him nod to me to go to the pulpit and read. I met with him many times outside of Mass to talk about things that were considered too complex to simply discuss in church. I asked questions like, if God is all-powerful, then where did evil come from? Why do we pray if God already has a plan, etc.? I took these questions to high school with me and started a class after class on Mondays that I called Faith Revealed. I was genuinely curious about the mentality of other religions and how they work. We met with all sorts of religions and non-religious people alike. All of this that I mentioned was to set up the picture for you to know that I was never not a true Catholic or not a true Christian. I was not only a true believer, but I genuinely wanted to know as much about God as possible. So these days when I say I am no longer religious, I get several responses. They either say, well, you probably weren't a true believer in the first place, or this is just a phase, you'll grow out of it. You should just try God and then you'll see. All of these answers are not only ignorant, but they're personally insulting. It implies that I'm lying about being a believer, and also that I have not done any searching. It implies that I am simply following a trend or trying to rebel. This could not be further from the truth. There is nothing that could make me happier than to believe that the God I once believed in so strongly actually exists, has a plan for me, loves me, and that I will be forever in His kingdom. My intentions were pure. I have always strived to know more about everything that I could. My involvement in the church was no exception. I dug as deeply as I could into some of Catholicism's most heavily revered topics. I wanted to know the science of transubstantiation. I wanted to know the science of creation. I wanted to know the science of the virgin birth or the resurrection. Not only that, I wanted to know the history of the churches and how they formed. If what they were telling me was true, then I wanted nothing more than to know as deeply as possible the merits of their claims, if only to teach the truth to others. This is when my true transformation from a theist to a doubter truly began. I had always had doubts, even as a child. I remember specifically around the 5th and 6th grade that I was extremely scared of going to bed. When I lay down at night, all I could think about was the idea of non-existence, and how none of the beliefs of the church really could make any sense scientifically. It was too much to bear one night. I remember going down the hallway to my parents, who were simply watching TV, and telling them that I no longer believed in God. They said they'll talk to me about it in the morning and to go to bed. I was so relieved. There was never another moment in my life where I felt the immensity of a weight lifted off my chest than this moment. This, of course, was well before my involvement in the church. I decided after that my doubt was simply God challenging me, as the Catholic Church claims. As I continued into my intellectual pursuits of Catholicism, I was met with an ugly truth. Catholicism is not all it claims to be. A tenet of the Catholic doctrine lies in their belief that they are the true form of Christianity. They alone are following the traditions passed down through Jesus Himself. This honestly couldn't be further from the truth. Many of the traditions of the Catholic Church are not in any way based on the Bible or the teachings of Jesus. These traditions are one born out of power and control at the time. I first want to talk about the canonization. To canonize something means to assemble. It's a Greek word meaning measuring stick. The Bible was not written at any one time or by any one person. It was written over hundreds of years by dozens of authors, and we have no historical basis to verify them. The Bible as we know it was assembled by man. This is not even the issue I have with the canonization. The issue that I have is that the church father, Athanasius, first provided the complete listing of the 66 books belonging to the canon. This means that the Bible wasn't assembled until the year 367 AD. I want to repeat this. 367 years passed from the death of Christ to the assembly of the Bible. 367 years of political turmoil, religious debates, geopolitics. Jesus did not have a Bible. The apostles did not have a Bible. The very first Christians did not have a Bible. It was entirely assembled by one man in a way that would benefit his own prejudices or feelings at the time. There were many churches at the time, but the one that won its battle for dominion was the Catholic Church. This was mainly due to its location in Rome. The Roman Empire was the most powerful political force in the world at the time. It's no hard task to see why this would win religiously. This is not divine, this is simply political. Any king or ruler at the time could have assembled the canon in a different way. The reason we have the New Testament assembled in the way we do is testament to the views and political climate in the day of Athanasius. Yet even then, I was able to dismiss this feeling of fear that I had that the Bible was assembled by men. I wrote it off as divinely inspired. I didn't want to believe politics could have a play in God's Word. So I dug even deeper. I wanted to look at other aspects of Catholicism, like the infallibility of the Pope. Papal infallibility is defined as an omission of error when in the exercise of his office as shepherd and teacher of all Christians. In virtue of his supreme apostolic authority, he defines a doctrine concerning faith or morals to be held by the whole Church. This essentially translates to, when the Pope is speaking for the Church, he can't be wrong. This doesn't account for his actions, this accounts for his doctrine. I was curious though and wanted to know more about papal history. Here's what I found. Pope John XII was a notorious sex fiend. He had sex with both men and women in the Vatican. When they refused, he would rape them. He held massive orgies at the tombs of both St. Peter and St. Paul. He castrated and murdered a cardinal. Benedict IX was not only a rapist of men and women, but practiced bestiality. He was deposed, regained the throne with the help of Conrad I, was forced out again, returned with an army to take it back again, sold the papacy to his grandfather for a fortune, regretted selling it, and came back with another army. He was quickly forced out again by yet another pope, refused to stand trial and was excommunicated, and he finally retired in obscurity. Stephen VII was insane in the most basic sense. He had the previous pope, Pope Formosus, dug up, nailed to a cross above the throne, and had the corpse stand trial. He had the corpse's fingers cut off, dressed the corpse in rags and reburied. However, even this was not enough. He had the corpse redug up and had stones tied to the body. He then threw the Pope's body into the Tiber River. A monk eventually rescued the corpse. I have many more examples of this, but for the interest of time, I would have you look up more if you're interested. I looked at this list and still said that this is actually in line with Catholic teaching. It teaches that the Pope is only infallible when speaking for the Church. It cannot account for the Pope's actions. Well, this is exactly the problem. I wish it was as simple as saying it is not the Pope's actions that matter and only his word. Yet how could you ever trust a Pope who did these things? I wanted to look at accounts of reasonably sane popes who had made decrees in the name of the Church to see if this idea of papal infallibility was true. I looked first to indulgences. One of the things that led to the Protestant Reformation was the abuse of indulgences by the Catholic Church. An indulgence is something a Catholic would do to shorten their time that someone, usually a loved one, would have to spend in purgatory, which once again was not mentioned in the Bible at all, either purgatory or indulgences. This was a way for the Church to make money off the despair someone would feel for a loved one. This sickened me to my core. How could a church need money to shorten the time someone spends in torture? It wasn't even used to shorten torture in hell. Hell was forever. Purgatory was conveniently for everyone. No matter how devoted you were in life, no matter how much money and time you spent on the Catholic Church, you had to go to purgatory. This seemed quite convenient to me when I realized how much money the Church was making at the time of indulgences. This meant that everyone who ever died was a potential target for the living. Even if you didn't know the person, Paying an indulgence for someone else was a way to help yourself in God's eyes later. Once again, convenient. There is absolutely no passages in the canonized Bible that speak to any of this. It seems to be a very successful scheme by the church to get as much money and power as possible. Even then, I would look at this and say that this has to be the work of the devil. This couldn't be the truth about how our church works. Even if I was losing faith in the Catholic Church, I was holding on to faith of Jesus Christ. There are many more instances I could mention, like how Friday the 13th is considered unlucky because Pope Clement V sent out orders for the arrest and execution of the Knights Templar. But I need to keep this semi-brief. I need to address one of the most monstrous things about the church before I go any further: child rape by priests. I also need to caveat this by dispelling what some may think. No, I was never raped or sexually assaulted in any way, but the fact that I have to say this is the problem. The fact that when I even mention spending time alone with some of the priests, a vast majority of my audience automatically assumes something happened to me. This is the issue that needs addressing. Catholic priests molest more children than any of their religious counterparts. Why is this? Human beings are animals. Any denial of this would be a denial of reality. We have urges, and these urges are sometimes suppressed by religion. One of these such urges is the drive to reproduce and have sex. When this urge is suppressed by the church, this becomes a huge issue. Catholic priests do not have suppressed urges. They can't even satiate them. They take vows of celibacy when they become priests. This means that they can never have sex or masturbate for as long as they live. This is suppression of animalistic instincts. We very rarely keep these vows. Yet what makes this idea even more harmful is the fact that the priests then interact with vulnerable little boys and girls. These urges that they are unable to quench are now brought to the surface of their minds with a temptation that they can just make them go away. I am not saying that any person who takes this vow will turn into a child molester, but I am simply saying that this situation does not help to hinder these people. What makes this all the more worse, however, is the fact that the Catholic Church tries their very best to cover up the scandal. They very routinely ship priests around from church to church once a complaint of sexual assault arises. They try their very best to maintain face and to hide the damage done to these children from the world. They pay off victims, physically coerce them, and do very little within the church system to stop it. There is essentially a systematic child rape ring being run by the world's most powerful religious organization.
When I was between the ages of 15 and 17 years old, I was sexually abused by a teacher at a private Catholic high school in Southern California. With me, it started with long conversations about my mom and how I was alone. Then he started telling me secrets, and he wanted me to share those secrets with nobody else. Then it moved into the kissing and the touching, and within a few months, it was full-blown sexual abuse. And it was so bad. By the time that the abuse ended, I was 17, and I was pregnant, and I had a sexually transmitted disease. In 2001, and this is before the Boston Globe covered the crisis in Boston, which is chronicled in the Spotlight film, we had a scandal here in California. And a boy who had been sexually abused by my high school principal came forward and filed a lawsuit. He ended up getting documents that showed that the diocese knew that my high school principal had been abusing boys for years, and they'd even sent him to a church-run treatment facility where they send priests who sexually molest kids. I contacted the diocese where I lived, and I said, hey, this happened to me, and I want to be a part of the solution. And they told me, well, why don't you sit on our lay review board, where you can review cases where, adults have come forward and said they were sexually abused as children by priests and employees and volunteers. And I sat on that committee for about 6 months, and we didn't review a single case. And I began to realize that I was being played again like I had been played in high school. They were buying my silence by putting me on this board. In the end, my lawsuit settled, and I got more than 200 pages of documents, secret documents, spotlight documents in my case. And they included the signed confession from the man who sexually abused me. He confessed to abusing me, and he confessed to abusing my friends. I got secret documents from school administrators who said, oh yeah, we knew that this was going on. We knew that Joelle was being sexually abused. And we decided to keep it quiet because it was better that way. The Catholic Church is very good at keeping records. In fact, they have a rule book. It's It's called the Code of Canon Law. Those are the rules and regulations that bishops and priests and employees and Catholics have to follow. And a lot of those rules have to do with documenting sin and documenting child sexual abuse. For victims, it's been a lifesaver because it's been the proof that we have needed all along to say, hey, this really happened.
And the 5-year-old kid, they're patting him down. He's going,
What are you doing? You're not a priest. Let go of me.
I see. So you've had a problem too, I guess. Father Pat's little private pat and chat's like, good game, boy, good game, good game. Wash up to me, really wash up. It's amazing they would catch them, and it wasn't just enough to catch them, but they had the Divine Witness Protection Program. You know, find the priest, here's the pedophile, here's the priest, find the pedophile, find the priest, find the pedophile, there, move him around. Here we go, we're going to say to make gay. Don't you ask, they make him in trouble. Here we go. Don't you ask, don't you tell, you might end up right in hell. Here we go, here we go. Here's your check direct from Rome. Buy yourself a brand new home. Moving around, moving around. But it was amazing when the Pope gathered all the cardinals in Rome and went, Teesh. The only problem is he's dressed like Liberace's stunt double. Whoops. I have a solution, though. For problem priest, little thing of shock collar. If they go near a kid, it's like, you know, Timmy. Oh. Tommy, I think. No, hit me. Or the automated confessional. Could be fun. If this is a venal sin, press 1. If this is a carnal sin, press 2. If this is cardinal law, please stay on the line. Because you have to remember, it's not just a sin, it's a felony. So we have to keep track.
Overall, there is one event that disturbed me the most about religion. It was the event of my uncle dying at a very early age. He was not particularly religious and didn't attend church much. Upon the news of his death in Mexico, my mother consulted the priest. From all she's ever told me, I gather that the priest told her that because he was not religious, he was currently in hell for the rest of eternity. By their own beliefs, you would have to know this is true. Yet somehow they were able to weasel their beliefs into a corner by ignoring large portions of the Bible which preach about hellfire and what will happen to non-believers. Somehow they were able to convince themselves that their religion allowed for non-believers to go to heaven. Their thinking had been articulated to me many times. I know how much I love you. I know God loves you infinitely more. There is no way I would ever hurt you, and I know that God would never do this with you either. Yet I feel the better way to represent God is to quote Richard Dawkins.
The God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all fiction. Jealous and proud of it, a petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak, a vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser, a misogynistic, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal, filicidal, pestilential, megalomaniacal, sadomasochistic, capriciously malevolent bully.
The only reason Christians believe the idea that God is loving and just is because they wish to see this. They ignore the literal tons of passages and stories that tell the opposite. The term God-fearing Christian always seemed odd to me, until I read the Bible. Then I realized what they were so afraid of. As I grew up, I realized I wanted to serve my country in the military. I joined the armed forces and was shipped off to boot camp. During my time there, whenever we had free time, which was very rarely during the day, we would talk about all sorts of topics. I became the sort of begrudging guru of our team. People would come to me to talk about history, politics, and of course religion. At this time, I still considered myself a Roman Catholic and would answer questions in my own ways, but would always fall back to the teachings of the Catholic Church. I had many religious friends there, and they were genuinely interested in my opinions. We talked every night, prayed before meals, and I even had St. Michael on my dog tags. When I was there, it was the farthest I had ever been from home. I was able to talk about many things, unrestrained and uncaring of my reception from others as we were all leaving soon. I learned many things about their own opinions, but more importantly, I learned about myself. I learned I was hiding something from myself. I was hiding my true beliefs. I was still that kid in 6th grade who mulled it over every night. I was still the kid who went downstairs and cried after being told Santa Claus didn't exist, even though I had put on a show that I didn't care. I was pretending to be religious. It was this non-suppression of free thought that allowed me to think for myself. It was the constant fear and willingness to fall on something greater than myself that allowed me to realize why I was religious in the first place. It was out of fear for the alternative. They say there were no atheists in foxholes, and this is probably true only so much as there is no one who wants to believe in a horrible alternative. No one wants to believe Santa Claus isn't real. Yet some of us, regardless of how bad we want it, are not capable of tricking ourselves forever. It may be done in the face of fear. It may be done at old age when the Reaper's scythe looms closer than we have ever been comfortable with. But it cannot last forever for me. I was not able to stomach it any longer. The Catholic in me died fully when I left for the military. Yet even then I could not stomach the thought that Christianity was wrong. I could believe in a Protestant version, as millions have done before me. I started to investigate. I wanted to examine some of the historical claims the Bible makes. This is the only way to determine if the Bible itself is correct or if the entire thing is flawed. The answers for me started to come earlier than the military. When I was a freshman at a state university, I took a class on early Sumerian history. Sumeria lies in what is now modern-day Iraq between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. I was told to read the world's oldest book, the Epic of Gilgamesh. This was a story written between 2500 and 2800 years BC. This makes this story of Gilgamesh not only the oldest surviving story, but older than the Torah, or Old Testament's, account of the biblical flood and Noah's Ark. Gilgamesh tells the story of a man named Gilgamesh who was told by a god that the other gods were planning to flood the earth. He was to build a boat and to gather as many animals as he had aboard the boat for after the flood. The flood lasted 7 days and the ground was flattened. All the humans had been turned to clay. Gilgamesh released doves to try to find land. His boat was ran aground on top of a mountain. All of these things were disturbing to me. If this story is indeed older than the biblical account, then the story of Noah and the flood is nothing more but borrowing of old mythology. It is a way of recycling old stories and twisting the story to work with your own beliefs. This was only one concern I had with the biblical story of Noah. Even if an unskilled old man, 500 years old, could build an ark big enough to house everything that the Bible claims it did, which in and of itself is impossible based on the proportions. Structurally, it is not possible to build a boat as they did. Then how could it account for animals' specialized diets? Koalas need eucalyptus, hummingbirds need nectar, etc. What about the predator-prey relationship? What about the waste that would be generated? How could animals have migrated to the ark? Did kangaroos jump across the ocean? What about animals that would have died en route? How much would that have weighed? Genesis states that there was to be only one opening. How could that have provided ventilation? I have many more questions than that. But not only this, there's absolutely no evidence in any stretch of the imagination at all that there was a universal flood. I want to make this clear. There is no evidence at all that there was a universal flood. Any theory that is proposed is absolutely preposterous. Besides, the biblical nuances which alone don't work, the science for the flood itself is completely destroyed. Quote, one estimate of the volume of water in the atmosphere at any one time is about 3,100 cubic miles, or 12,900 cubic kilometers. That may sound like a lot, but it's only 0.001% of the total Earth's water volume of about 332,500,000. If all of the water in the atmosphere rained down at once, it would only cover the ground to a depth of 2.5 centimeters, or about an inch. Unquote. There are many more reasons scientifically why the biblical flood could simply not happen, but in the interest of time, I will move on.
Mr. Ham and his followers have this remarkable view of a worldwide flood that somehow influenced everything that we observe in nature. A 500-foot wooden boat, 8 zookeepers for 14,000 individual animals, every land plant in the world underwater for a full year. I ask us all, is that really reasonable? You'll hear a lot about the Grand Canyon, I imagine, also, which is a remarkable place, and it has fossils. And the fossils in the Grand Canyon are found in layers. There is not a single place in the Grand Canyon where the fossils of one type of animal cross over into the fossils of another. In other words, when there was a big flood on the earth, you would expect drowning animals to swim up to a higher level. Not any one of them did. Not a single one. If you could find evidence of that, my friends, you could change the world. One of the extraordinary claims associated with Mr. Ham's worldview is that this giant boat, very large wooden ship, went aground safely on a mountain in the Middle East, what we now call the Middle East. And so places like Australia are populated then by animals who somehow managed to get from the Middle East all the way to Australia in the last 4,000 years. Now, that to me is an extraordinary claim. We would expect then, somewhere between the Middle East and Australia, we would expect to find evidence of kangaroos. We would expect to find some fossils, some bones. In the last 4,000 years, somebody would have been hopping along there and died along the way, and we'd find them. And furthermore, there's a claim that there was a land bridge that allowed these animals to get from Asia all the way to the continent of Australia, and that land bridge has disappeared in the last 4,000 years. No navigator, no diver, no U.S. Navy submarine, no one's ever detected any evidence of this, let alone any fossils of kangaroos. So your expectation is not met. It doesn't seem to hold up. Another remarkable thing I'd like everybody to consider, inherent in this worldview, is that somehow Noah and his family were able to build a wooden ship that would house 14,000 individuals. There are 7,000 kinds, and there's a boy and a girl for each one of those. So it's about 14,008 people. And these people were unskilled. As far as anybody knows, they had never built a wooden ship before. Furthermore, they had to get all these animals on there, and they had to feed them, and I understand that Mr. Ham has some explanations for that, which I frankly find extraordinary, but this is the premise of the bit. And we can then run a test, a scientific test. People in the early 1900s built an extraordinary large wooden ship, the Wyoming. It was a 6-masted schooner, the largest one ever built. It had a motor on it for winching cables and stuff. But this boat had a great difficulty. It was not as big as the Titanic, but it was a very long ship. It would twist in the sea. It would twist this way, and this way. And in all that twisting, it leaked. It leaked like crazy. The crew could not keep the ship dry. And indeed, it eventually foundered and sank, loss of all 14 hands. So there were 14 crewmen aboard a ship built by very, very skilled shipwrights in New England. These guys were the best in the world at wooden shipbuilding. And they couldn't build a boat as big as the Ark is claimed to have been. Is that reasonable? Is that possible? That the best shipbuilders in the world couldn't do what 8 unskilled people, men and their wives, were able to do? Shipwrights, my ancestors, the Nye family in New England, spent their whole life learning to make ships. I mean, it's very reasonable perhaps to you that Noah had superpowers and was able to build this extraordinary craft with 7 family members, but to me it's just not reasonable.
So if the biblical flood didn't happen, what else wasn't true? One of the other claims the Bible makes is about the Jewish people being enslaved in Egypt. This is a cornerstone of the Old Testament because it sets the Jews apart as God's chosen people. Yet once again, there is no evidence of any kind that Jews were enslaved in Egypt. None at all. Quote, "The reality is that there is no evidence whatsoever that the Jews were ever enslaved in Egypt. Yes, there's the story contained within the Bible itself, but that's not a remotely historical admissible source. I'm talking about real proof, archaeological evidence, state records, or primary sources. Of these, nothing exists. It is hard to believe that 600,000 families, which would mean about 2 million people, crossed the entire Sinai without leaving one shard of pottery, the archaeologist's best friend, with Hebrew writing on it. It is remarkable that Egyptian records make no mention of the sudden migration of what would have been nearly a quarter of their population, nor has any evidence been found for any of the expected effects of such an exodus, such as economic downturn or labor shortages. Furthermore, there is no evidence in Israel that shows a sudden influx of people from another culture at that time. No rapid departure from traditional pottery has been seen, no record or story of a surge in population. In fact, there's absolutely no more evidence to suggest that the story is true than there is in support of any of the Arab world conspiracy theories and tall tales about Jews." Unquote. This doesn't even cover the Exodus itself. The Bible claims that Moses parted the Red Sea and brought the water down onto the Egyptian chariots, yet there is no archaeological evidence of any kind in the sea itself. There were thousands of chariots with thousands of weapons, none of which have ever been found. not to mention the 40 years the Israelites wandered in the desert who conveniently left no evidence of their existence. One of the most important stories in the Bible is the story of creation. If we are going to examine the flaws with this story, we need to first understand several things. One of these things is radiocarbon dating. Quote, radiocarbon dating, also referred to as carbon dating or carbon-14 dating, is a method for determining the age of an object containing organic material by using the properties of radiocarbon, a radioactive isotope of carbon. Unquote. Essentially, carbon-14 is radioactive and thus has half-lives. This is a very accurate way to measure materials and date them with extreme accuracy. This, along with other ways, is what determines the age of objects. This is the cornerstone of archaeological dating. One of the biggest problems with the creation story is the fact that dinosaurs existed. This can be explained by saying God's days are not literal days, therefore they didn't all coexist, but this is a cop-out, for then everything could be made to be taken figuratively and the entire Bible falls apart. The Bible is not a buffet, you cannot pick and choose what you want to believe or not. Dinosaurs absolutely never coexisted with humans. Cavemen were not eating T-Rex meat every day. Dinosaurs existed 65 million years ago and dominated the earth for an extremely long time. The Bible claims that everything was created alongside each other and coexisted in one place. This would include every species of bird, fish, reptile, mammal, etc. Without thought for their environment. There was supposed to be no violence because this was a perfect place. Yet animals were easily identified in a predator-prey relationship. The fact that humans have their eyes in the front of their heads to determine depth better naturally sets us apart as a hunter. Other animals have eyes along the side, so their field of view is better to help with detection of predators. This doesn't even touch the fact that animals and us had bodies that were streamlined for killing. Why would bears need claws and teeth if not to fight? Why would we need a digestive tract and certain teeth capable of chewing meat? This doesn't even begin to touch the fact that genetic inbreeding between only two organisms, Adam and Eve, would result in a disastrous gene pool. Yet the fact that dinosaurs existed is the worst blow to this story as a whole. We did not ever exist alongside dinosaurs. We had millions of years of separation. We are not even found in the same layer of the earth, indicating approximate time that we existed in. The Bible cannot account for these animals that ruled the earth for millions of years before we ever existed. All of this was starting to scare me. It all seemed to point to the fact that there is no evidence that biblical stories will turn out to be true. I decided to look not at simply stories, which could have been fabricated, and look for the perfect composition of the Bible itself. If it is divinely inspired, it should be free of contradictions. Is it? There are quite literally hundreds more contradictions in the Bible. So many that this would easily take hours to cover. How is this possible? How is it that the Bible, which is supposed to be divinely inspired, can have so many simple errors? I originally thought that we could chalk this up to translation error, but then the logic of that even falls apart. If God inspired the Bible to be written by men, yet it is divinely inspired, how many generations of translations is still inspired? To put this more simply, is only the first version inspired? Does every sequential version become more and more uninspired? Does God work this way? Statistically speaking, he shouldn't. There are far more people alive today and throughout history that have read translated versions. Very few read the original Aramaic. If he wanted to affect the most people, he should have waited. It made literally no sense to me at all. Is none of the Bible inspired? If so, why should I believe it at all? Using Spider-Man comics to prove the existence of Spider-Man is ridiculous. If the Bible isn't divinely inspired, then the Spider-Man comics hold as much validity as these old desert holy books. Maybe I was able to let go of most of the stories. I could say that the Bible was meant to be analogous. The flood may not have happened, but it taught us stories. The Jews weren't enslaved, and Moses never saved them, but it taught us stories. I'm not sure what some passages are meant to teach us other than pure evil. But this aside, there are certain stories that have proven to be wrong would undermine the Bible's central theme. These main stories were creation and the resurrection. All of the others may be stories that didn't happen, but if the stories of those two turn out to be false, the main tenets disappear. The creation story teaches us that we are sinners and therefore in need of being saved. The resurrection story teaches us that we were saved and that all we need to do is believe the main teachings of the church and accept Jesus Christ. There were several theories I did not want to examine in fear that they would be true. Those theories were Darwinian evolution by natural selection and the Big Bang, both of which would blow the Genesis story out of the water. I wanted to look at some of the questions that no longer seem silly to ask. These are questions that seem so odd to me as a Catholic, borderline malevolent in their questioning, yet now I wanted real answers. Why does God choose who he heals? Why does he only cure invisible diseases? What I mean by this is, why does God only heal cancer instead of growing back limbs? When someone in a church gets cancer, the group gathers together to pray for the afflicted. It would seem the survival rate for those who are prayed for happen to coincide perfectly with the medical survival rates. Why is this? Shouldn't we notice a difference in the rates of cure? Shouldn't victims who are prayed for recover at higher rates than those who weren't? This would make sense biblically, yet we don't see this. Cancer kills regardless if we pray or not. It seems that God either doesn't listen to these prayers or simply doesn't do anything at all. Why pray then? What does it do? Also, once the afflicted are cured, God is thanked. Why thank him? You have no evidence he helped them. Yet when someone dies, God's not cursed. If he has the power to save yet did nothing, this means he allowed them to die. He wanted them dead. Does God have a divine plan for the universe? Then why pray? You won't change God's mind. You are simply hoping his plans coincide with your own. Even if you are religious, the concept of prayer never made sense. Why does God not cure amputees? If God cures cancer, there is no proof that it was God. The chemotherapy was working. The medicine beat the disease. But if God grows back limbs, we have evidence of a true miracle. Yet there has never been a case where this has happened. Ever. Our medical survival rates happen to coincide perfectly with rates of medical treatment. It seems that God only heals those in developed countries. Does prayer work? As George Carlin said,
trillions and trillions of prayers every day, asking and pleading and begging for favors. Do this, give me that, I need a new car, I want a better job. And most of this praying takes place on Sunday, his day off. It's not nice, and it's no way to treat a friend. But people do pray, and they pray for a lot of different things. And I say, fine, pray for anything you want, pray for anything. But what about the divine plan? Remember that? The divine plan. Long time ago, God made a divine plan, gave it a lot of thought, decided it was a good plan, put it into practice. And for billions and billions of years, the divine plan has been doing just fine. Now you come along and pray for something. Well, suppose the thing you want isn't in God's divine plan. What do you want him to do? Change his plan? Just for you? Doesn't it seem a little arrogant? It's a divine plan. What's the use of being God if every rundown schmuck with a $2 prayer book can come along and fuck up your plan? And here's something else, another problem you might have. Suppose your prayers aren't answered. What do you say? Well, it's God's will. Thy will be done. Fine, but if it's God's will and he's going to do what he wants to anyway, why the fuck bother praying in the first place? Seems like a big waste of time to me. Couldn't you just skip the praying part and go right to his will? It's all very confusing.
This is honestly an amazing point. If God has a plan, what is the point of prayer? I understand prayers that thank God for things, but even those don't make perfect sense. If you're thankful, it doesn't matter. God will do as he wishes anyway. Sometimes the most thankful people have had bad things happen to them, and the most unthankful people have had good luck. The two seem to be unconnected. So the idea of a prayer that asks for something is downright absurd. What about evangelization? Why would I want to convert people to Christianity? The Bible talks about going out and making more Christians, spread the good news. But why would I do this? Evangelization only leads to damnation. What do I mean by this? I'll let an Eskimo tell you. This is a very important realization. If you do not know about the Bible at all, like a Pacific Islander or an Eskimo, then you cannot be damned to hell for eternity. If you do know, however, you're essentially out of luck. You have to adhere to the Bible strictly, so when I preach to people who have never been told about the Bible, I am only causing certain people to go to hell for eternity, where if I did nothing, they would have all been saved. This idea is not as crazy as it sounds. It seems to me the only logical reason to do this is because the church needs money. They can't have all of their followers only last for a generation. They want to have an ongoing cycle of people, power, and money. This last question I have will be the most important. I was attending a Catholic conference with my father one afternoon where a bishop, in the Catholic Church, a bishop is an ordained minister who holds the fullness of the sacrament of holy orders and is responsible for teaching doctrine, governing Catholics in his jurisdiction, and sanctifying the world and representing the church, was teaching. I was extremely excited to ask him this question because I had been struggling with it for a long time. Epicurus was an ancient Greek philosopher as well as the founder of the school of philosophy called Epicureanism, said it best. What Epicurus is saying here is that God needs to be one of the four things mentioned. He is either willing to prevent evil but not capable of doing so. This cannot make him omnipotent, unlimited power. The old question is, can God create a rock he is unable to move? If God is omnipotent, surely he can lift any rock. A rock which God cannot lift, therefore, cannot possibly exist. Its existence would contradict God's omnipotence. Because, in this argument, God is constrained by logic, God cannot create something that cannot exist. He is either able but not willing. This makes him evil. He has the power to help us but chooses not to do so. He is either both willing and able. Then how did evil happen? If God wants to end evil, why was it created? He does everything. This doesn't make any sense because if he wants evil to end and is capable of doing so, it would have already happened / wouldn't have happened in the first place because God wouldn't have made it to begin with. If God is all-powerful, all-knowing, and everywhere, he can't be fooled. This means he either created evil and is therefore capable and responsible for everything that has happened because of evil, or he isn't powerful. You can't have it both ways. The last way for God to be is neither able nor willing. Why do we consider him to be God then? I am not able to prevent evil, but I am willing to do so. So someone who is unable to, and doesn't even want to, should not be considered God. The bishop gave me an answer that would push me over the edge. He said, God works in mysterious ways. This made me so angry. It was an absolute non-answer. He seemed physically angry at me for even asking the question. How can a question ever be bad? Knowledge is the pursuit of God's mind. Maybe not. The tree of knowledge was forbidden. How can such a noble thing ever be bad? The answer he gave me troubled me because I then realized that no one had the answer. We are all born on this pale blue dot drifting through space alone in our own minds. None of us has done this before. None of us have the answers for sure. I realized at that moment that I had just as much time to contemplate existence as every other being who had ever walked this earth. If I was going to find my answers, it was going to have to be on my own.
How much more satisfying had we been placed in a garden custom-made for us, its other occupants put there for us to use as we saw fit. There is a celebrated story in the Western tradition like this, except that not quite everything was there for us. There was one particular tree of which we were not to partake, a tree of knowledge. Knowledge and understanding and wisdom were forbidden to us in this story. We were to be kept ignorant. But we couldn't help ourselves. We were starving for knowledge, created hungry, you might say. This was the origin of all our troubles. In particular, it's why we no longer live in a garden. We found out too much. So long as we were incurious and obedient, I imagine, we could console ourselves with our importance and centrality, and tell ourselves that we were the reason the universe was made. As we began to indulge our curiosity, though, to explore, to learn how the universe really is, we expelled ourselves from Eden. Angels with a flaming sword were set as sentries at the gates of paradise to bar our return. The gardeners became exiles and wanderers. Occasionally, we mourn that lost world, but that, it seems to me, is maudlin and sentimental. We could not happily have remained ignorant forever.
Even through all of these things, I did not want to believe a God couldn't exist. Even if it wasn't the Christian God, I wanted to know whether something watched over me. This had always haunted me. I didn't want to believe that my God wasn't the right one. Yet not even that, it seemed to dictate that the odds of any particular God being correct is nearly impossible. It was simply my geography and time period that determined my God.
This is probably going to be the most simplest one for you to answer, but what if you're wrong?
Well, what if I'm wrong? I mean, anybody could be wrong. We could all be wrong about the flying spaghetti monster and the pink unicorn and the flying teapot. You happen to have been brought up, I would presume, in the Christian faith. You know what it's like not to believe in a particular faith because you're not a Muslim, you're not a Hindu. Why aren't you a Hindu? Because you happen to have been brought up in America, not in India. If you'd been brought up in India, you'd be a Hindu. If you were brought up in Denmark in the time of the Vikings, you'd be believing in Wotan and Thor. If you were brought up in classical Greece, you'd be believing in Zeus. If you were brought up in Central Africa, you'd be believing in the great Juju up the mountain. There's no particular reason to pick on the Judeo-Christian God in which, by the sheerest accident, you happen to have been brought up, and ask me the question, what if I'm wrong? What if you're wrong about the great Juju at the bottom of the sea?
It makes perfect sense to realize that the odds of your personal God being the correct one are near zero. Therefore, the only theistic logical stance to take is that there may be a God, but he certainly isn't known of. He doesn't interfere with humanity or the order of the world. This form is referred to as deism. Quote, the belief that God has created the universe but remains apart from it and permits his creation to administer itself through natural laws. Deism thus rejects the supernatural aspects of religion, such as belief in revelation in the Bible, and stresses the importance of ethical conduct. Unquote. This seems like the only place left to turn besides falling into atheism entirely. I figure that even with all of the answers proving religion as a whole to be false, I was holding on to love and morality. There would be no reason for us to have them if they were simply a product of chance. God had to have instilled them in us, yet as I found out, even this stance is impossible.
Let's say that the consensus is that our species, we being the higher primates, Homo sapiens has been on the planet for at least 100,000 years, maybe more. Francis Collins says maybe 100,000. Richard Dawkins thinks maybe 250,000. I'll take 100,000. In order to be a Christian, you have to believe that for 98,000 years, our species suffered and died, most of its children dying in childbirth, most other people having a life expectancy of about 25, dying of their teeth, famine, struggle, bitterness, war, suffering, misery, all of that for 98,000 years. Heaven watches it with complete indifference. And then 2,000 years ago thinks, that's enough of that. It's time to intervene. The best way to do this would be by condemning someone to a human sacrifice somewhere in the less literate parts of the Middle East. Let's appeal to the Chinese, for example, where people can read and study evidence and have a civilization. Let's go to the desert and have another revelation there. This is nonsense. It can't be believed by a thinking person. This is a totalitarian system. If there was a God who could do these things and demand these things of us, and who was eternal and unchanging, we would be living under a dictatorship from which there was no appeal, and one that could never change, and one that knows our thoughts and can convict us of thought crime and condemn us to eternal punishment for actions that we are condemned in advance to be taking. All this in the round, and I could say more, it's an excellent thing that there's absolutely no reason to believe any of it to be true.
There were certain hypotheses that seemed, at first glance, to be pointing in the direction of a god, still light years off from pointing to any specific god. One of these hypotheses is called irreducible complexity. Quote, irreducible complexity, or IC, is a pseudo-scientific argument that postulates that certain biological systems are too complex to have evolved from simpler or less complete predecessors through natural selection acting upon a series of advantageous, naturally occurring chance mutations. Unquote. To put this more simply, they claim that some things simply couldn't have evolved because they are just too complex. One of the arguments commonly used is the human eye. The human eye is something of irreducible complexity. If only one fraction of any of the parts stopped functioning correctly, the entire eye would cease to work. Besides the fact that science has rejected this idea of irreducible complexity, this alone doesn't make sense. A hawk has a much more effective eye than humans do. Why was a hawk chosen over a human? We were made in God's image. Why wouldn't we be the best across the board? This doesn't even begin to cover the fact that most humans need eyeglasses to even see at all. The human eye is not irreducibly complex. It has complexity, of course, but to say that it is so complicated, implying it is so perfect, that only a god could have created it, is absurd. This is when evolution reared its ugly head again. If I was to find a solution to this god problem, I needed a theory that accurately described the world logically. Yet again, I didn't want to know. There are many more reasons why irreducible complexity has been rejected from the scientific community, but I encourage you to do your own research. The other hypothesis is the fine-tuning of the universe. Quote, the fine-tuned universe is the proposition that the conditions that allow life in the universe can only occur when certain universal fundamental physical constraints lie within a very narrow range, so that if any of these several fundamental constraints were only slightly different, the universe would be unlikely to be conducive to the establishment and development of matter, astronomical structures, elemental diversity, or life as it is understood. Unquote. Plainly stated, this means that the universe is set up so perfectly for life that if the four forces of the universe, gravity, electromagnetism, strong and weak nuclear force, were off ever so slightly, then our universe would cease to exist. It implies that this could not have happened by chance. The odds would be greater than winning the lottery a billion times in a row. Once again, I love this idea because I thought it meant that science could prove that the universe had a creator, just not any specific religion, which at this point I was beginning to be thankful for this because of the things I was reading in the Bible. Yet it is rejected by science. Quote, there is now broad agreement among physicists and cosmologists that the universe is in several aspects fine-tuned for life. However, the conclusion is not so much that the universe is fine-tuned for life, rather it is fine-tuned for the building blocks and environments that life requires. Unquote. That quotation was from Paul Davies. It is simply looking at it the wrong way. When someone says that the Earth in particular is fine-tuned for life, they don't understand the scientific way for looking at it. The Earth is not fine-tuned for us, we fine-tuned ourselves to it. This process takes quite literally billions of years. This is a concept that our hominid brains have a hard time understanding. We are used to deciphering things of medium size moving at medium speeds for a medium amount of time. We cannot truly understand billions of years. It is a testament to our brains that we can do this at all, however feebly. Another answer to this hypothesis is the multiverse. I intentionally stayed away from this topic as it has no evidence to support it of any kind. I didn't want to risk sounding as if I am exhibiting religious dogmatism. Yet the philosophical concept exists, so I will address it. It states that there is not just one universe. There are an unlimited number of universes, each with their own sets of physical laws and constraints. It is no wonder that when we observe the universe, it seems to be fine-tuned. It could not be any other way because we are able to observe it. Observers would only see fine-tuned universes. They cannot see non-fine-tuned universes because they cannot exist to observe them.
How is it that we find ourselves not merely existing, but surrounded by such complexity, such elegance, such endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful? The answer is this: it could not have been otherwise, given that we are capable of noticing our existence at all and of asking questions about it. It is no accident, as cosmologists point out to us, that we see stars in our sky. There may be universes without stars in them, universes whose physical laws and constants leave the primordial hydrogen evenly spread and not concentrated into stars. But nobody is observing those universes. Stars are the furnaces in which the majority of the chemical elements are forged, and you can't have life without a rich chemistry.
The creation of the solar system is something I have also struggled with. It shows the Bible to not be only historically wrong, but scientifically wrong. It shows that the way we have viewed ourselves for thousands of years is wrong. We are not the center of the universe, nor are we special in any way. We are one small planet in a solar system with one average star. That star is a part of billions and billions of other stars, each most likely with planets and moons of their own. Together they form one medium-sized galaxy, which is a part of billions and billions of other galaxies. Yet we claim to be special.
How is it that hardly any major religion has looked at science and concluded, this is better than we thought? The universe is much bigger than our prophets said, grander, more subtle, more elegant. Instead they say, no, 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 my God is a little God, and I want him to stay that way. A religion, old or new, that stressed the magnificence of the universe, as revealed by modern science, might be able to draw forth reserves of reverence and awe hardly tapped by the conventional faiths.
It has always surprised me that this kind of arrogance exists, although it could very well be ignorance. The cosmos is so vast that words to describe it fall short. One must believe to be religious that God created all of the space of the universe, yet we are the only part he is concerned about. Yet God cares about my sex life? I began to realize what a silly idea this was. This is only one galaxy among potentially endless galaxies. A belief in a God at all, yet alone one that is personal, was becoming more and more dead in my mind.
Consider again that pale blue dot we've been talking about. Imagine that you take a good long look at it. Imagine you're staring at the dot for any length of time. And then, try to convince yourself that God created the whole universe for one of the 10 million or so species of life that inhabit that speck of dust. Now take it a step further. Imagine that everything was made just for a single shade of that species, or gender, or ethnic or religious subdivision. We can recognize here a shortcoming, in some circumstances serious, in our ability to understand the world. Characteristically, we seem compelled to project our own nature onto nature. Man, in his arrogance, thinks himself a great work, worthy of the interposition of a deity.
It seemed to me that religion had adopted a kind of thinking called the God of the Gaps argument. Whereas any time there is not a complete scientific understanding of something, the religious among us will claim that this is proof of God. Science cannot fill in the gaps, therefore God done it. This is not only ridiculous, but will easily be proven wrong.
We now return to Carl Sagan's Cosmos, edited for Rednecks.
I'm Carl Sagan. Just how old is our planet? Scientists believe it's
hundreds and hundreds of years old.
Scientists have determined that the universe was created by a God. Big Bang. If you look at the bones of a Tyrannosaurus Rex, it's clear by the use of carbon dating that
Mountain Dew is the best soda ever made.
As Neil deGrasse Tyson says,
this shows up a lot. Newton even said it. He had his laws of gravity and motion, and he was explaining the moon and the planet. He was there. He doesn't mention God for any of that. And then he gets to the limits of what his equations can calculate. So can't quite figure this out. Maybe God steps in and makes it right every now and then. That's where he invoked God. And Ptolemy, he bet on the wrong horse, but he was a brilliant guy. He formulated the geocentric universe with Earth in the middle. This is where we got epicycles and the machinations of the heavens. There was still a mystery to him. He looked up and uttered the following words: when I trace at my pleasure the windings to and fro of the heavenly bodies. These are the planets going through retrograde and back. The mysteries of the universe. When I trace at my pleasure the windings to and fro of the heavenly bodies, I no longer touch earth with my feet. I stand in the presence of Zeus himself and take my fill of ambrosia. What he did was he didn't invoke Zeus to account for the rock that he's standing on or the air he's breathing. It was this point of mystery, and in gets invoked God. This, over time, has been described by philosophers as the God of the gaps. Mm-hmm. If that's where you're going to put your God in this world, then God is an ever-receding pocket of scientific ignorance. If that's how you're going to invoke God, if God is the mystery of the universe, these mysteries, we're tackling these mysteries one by one. If you're going to stay religious at the end of the conversation, God has to be more to you than just where science has yet to tread. So to the person who says, maybe dark matter is God, if the only reason why you're saying it's because it's a mystery, then get ready to have that undone.
it makes no sense to invoke God in these instances. Scientists do not have an answer to the why of the universe, yet. This is not to say that they never will. They may never, though, because the answer might be incomprehensible to humans. Science is questions that may never be answered, while religion is answers which must never be questioned. Scientists do not claim to know everything, but that's the beauty of it. The fact that they don't, the fact that they wait for evidence, is what makes science so beautiful. It is not simply a class to take in school or a subject to study. It is a way to think. It is a philosophy. It is not satisfied with authority on a subject, and it does not adhere to traditions. It seeks out truth, however difficult. I am reminded of I pursi muove. Galileo Galilei is quoted to have said this. Historically, it is still a bit fuzzy. To the Inquisition when he was forced to recant his claims that the earth revolves around the sun and not vice versa, or face being burnt alive by the Catholic Church. It means, and yet it moves. I realize now that all of my disbelief in science, all of my hatred of atheists didn't matter to reality. I can choose to put my head in the sand, but the world exists outside my own mind, and yet it moves. It was time to tackle some of the most hotly debated topics of our time: Darwinian evolution by natural selection and the Big Bang.
The Big Bang Theory is a set of descriptions detailing the expansion of our universe from a tiny, super dense, super hot speck to the enormous cosmos that we know today. These descriptions are in the mathematical language of physics, and they build on and are supported by many experiments, from astronomical observations to particle collider experiments to supercomputer simulations. Some of these experiments have verified certain parts of the theory beyond reasonable doubt, while other parts remain untested. Let's start with the irrefutable. The universe is expanding. Light from distant galaxies is redshifted, stretched to longer wavelengths, and the further away the galaxy is, the more its light is stretched. In the context of Einstein's theory of general relativity, the only sensible interpretation for this fact is that space itself is expanding, and light travelling through expanding space is stretched. The more distance travelled, the more it's stretched. The universe is definitely expanding now, and so we know that once upon a time it had to be much smaller. See, this is the wonder of physics. We can look at the current state of the universe, or even just a tiny part of the universe, and run the laws of physics forward in time to predict the future, or run those laws backwards and predict the past. If we rewind the universe using the mathematics of general relativity, then the further back you go, the smaller the universe is. In fact, with raw general relativity, we get that the entire observable universe was once compacted into an infinitesimal point, a singularity, at time t equals 0.
The Big Bang Theory is the prevailing cosmological model for the universe, from the earliest known periods through its subsequent large-scale evolution. The model accounts for the fact that the universe expanded from a very high density and high temperature state, and offers a comprehensive explanation for a broad range of phenomena, including the abundance of light elements, the cosmic microwave background, large-scale structures, and Hubble's law, unquote. To break this down, the Big Bang was the creation of the universe as we know it. It was matter and energy becoming separated, and the fabric of space-time itself expanding. There was no bang, it was time itself, matter, energy, dark energy, and the laws of physics themselves being brought into existence. Quote, Hubble observed that the differences to faraway galaxies were strongly correlated with their redshifts. This was interpreted to mean that all distant galaxies and clusters are receding away from our vantage point with an apparent velocity proportional to their distance. That is, the farther they are, the faster they move away from us regardless of direction, unquote. If you were to wind back the clocks, the universe has to have had a singular point. This is akin to seeing a snowball rolling down a hill. You have to capitulate that the snowball started at the top of the hill. This theory was postulated by Albert Einstein, who developed the general theory of relativity. This requires so much more than I could ever hope to fit into this, that it is pointless to try to name them all. I will say that the Big Bang is not something that is up for debate any longer. Multiple realms of science confirm what this theory claims. General relativity predicts a lot of strange things. One of these things is time dilation. Objects that move at high speeds or objects that are affected by strong gravitational fields experience time differently relative to an observer, thus relativity. This is proven by atomic clocks, along with the mathematical proof. If Einstein's theory was not taken into account when satellites were launched to work with GPSs here on Earth, then the GPS would be miles off. Satellites travel at extremely fast speeds, not nearly light speed, but enough to start having some effects. For something as precise as a GPS, clocks need to be in sync with the satellites in orbits and the clocks on Earth. Yet, the atomic clocks in orbit do not match with the ones stationary relative to the space clocks. Atomic clocks are based on atomic physics. They use the microwave signal emitted from electrons as they change energy levels. An atomic clock in Switzerland has been running since 2004 and has an uncertainty rate for 1 second for 1 in every 30 million years. These clocks are not inaccurate by any stretch of the imagination. Yet once you place them in orbit at high speeds, they slow down. This is because of special relativity. The theory made a prediction and it was proven true in real-world applicational tests. The cornerstone of a theory is its ability to make predictions and for them to be proven right. Einstein has had nothing proven incorrect with general relativity yet, not a single thing. This is not to say that everything in this theory will be correct, but what it means is that as a whole, his theory has stood the test of time and science. It is the way we view the universe on a grand scale, quantum mechanics being the way we view it on a small scale. They currently do not work together but work separately. The unified theory, or the theory of everything, will be needed to unify the two theories. To really help understand this, I recommend the following books: A Brief History of Time and The Grand Design by Stephen Hawking. Hawking is able to truly make this understandable for everyone. The Theory of Darwinian Evolution by Natural Selection was something I remember fighting my teachers about my freshman year of high school. We were taught the theory in a natural sciences class, and I was so angry. I explained to my teacher all of the so-called fabrications in the theory, how I believed that I knew it all. It was just a theory after all. There was no room for it in my life. I realize now that I was afraid of it. I knew even back then that if the theory turned out to be true, it would undermine the story of creation. I decided to study as much as I could to prove it wrong. One needs to look at multiple disciplines of science to understand how theories work. I also need to clarify something before I go any further. The word theory is used differently in the scientific community than it is in the lay community. An average person uses the word theory to describe what scientists would call a hypothesis. When this word is used, it's assumed to be unproven and simply a hunch. Yet gravity is still a theory.
You don't believe that the Earth is round only if you're an astronaut. You don't believe Napoleon existed only if you're a historian. You believe these things because they're facts proved by evidence. Evolution is also a demonstrated fact. The truth really is out there. It's not a matter of opinion. Relativism, the quaint notion that there are many truths all equally deserving of respect even if they contradict each other, is rife today. It sounds like a respectful gesture towards multiculturalism. Actually, it's a pretentious cop-out. There really is something special about scientific evidence. Science works, planes fly, magic carpets and broomsticks don't. Gravity is not a version of the truth, it is the truth. Anybody who doubts it is invited to jump out of a 10th floor window. Evolution, too, is reality. You don't decide whether to believe it or not believe it on the basis of whim or culture. The evidence supports it. Evolution is the plain truth.
Theory in science is used to mean something that is irrefutably true. They use the word theory because fact is arrogant. It does not mean it can't be proven incorrect, but it means that to do so would require extraordinary evidence to the contrary. It is not simply proven right by multiple disciplines of science, but it makes predictions about things that are proven to be true. Before I talk about evidence for evolution as a whole, I need to first explain what it means and what the implications for it are. Darwinian evolution by natural selection is, quote, change in the hereditable traits of biological populations over successive generations. Evolutionary processes give rise to diversity at every level of biological organization, including the level of species, individual organisms, and molecules, unquote. What this means simply is that organisms are diverse based off of traits that were passed down through the generations. An easy-to-understand evolutionary trait example is that of the giraffe. It was certainly not designed intelligently. Giraffes have all sorts of problems due to their increased neck. They have to have an extremely strong heart to pump the blood against gravity. If they don't, the giraffe will pass out due to lack of blood. When the giraffe bends down to get water, it spreads its legs and has to hold the neck near the ground. This requires extraordinary neck muscles, and if it holds its head down too long, blood will accumulate in the brain and kill it. They have heart problems later in life for this exact reason. Yet there is an advantage to having a long neck when you are a herbivore with tall trees around. Giraffes and trees have a closely linked past. Giraffes had normal necks at one point, yet as the trees grew taller, some giraffes couldn't get as much nutrients as they needed because they couldn't reach the trees. The giraffes that had a genetic mutation which caused their necks to be slightly longer than normal had an advantage. If you don't believe this can happen, look at your earlobes. Are they attached? Some are and some aren't. It's not important to humans because it serves no purpose. Yet, if it provided us with an evolutionary advantage, it would be naturally selected because it made us either more attractive to the opposite sex or helped us to survive. Giraffes function the same way. Certain mutations that wouldn't have meant much before soon meant a lot. The trees grew taller to avoid being eaten, natural selection, and so did the giraffes. The same worked for Brachiosaurus, long-necked dinosaur. Neck stretching seemed to be a common evolutionary trait. Now, to make this more than simply a hypothesis, evolution would need a prediction. It would hope to find species in transition with these trees. It does. Not only this, certain species of animals exist that are related to the giraffe family today with short necks. They are called okapis. This is also important to point out. Just because okapis are alive today does not mean giraffes did not evolve from these animals. This is a wrong way of understanding evolution. Animals do not evolve and devolve as if they were stages, and each succeeding one is better than the last. Giraffes share a common ancestor with okapis, just as we share common ancestors with apes. Okapis exist today because they are good at being okapis. There's nothing wrong with them. A certain lineage of okapi in the past diverged from the okapi line we see today. They coexisted for millions of years, and we now have the genetic diversity we see today. This is not only in fossil records, but in the DNA of the animal itself. This is what I mean by predictions. Evolution predicts that these animals are related, and a field, or discipline, of science finds this to be true. It made a cross-discipline prediction. Evolution makes thousands of these predictions and is proven right time and time again. Here's a short list. Just like biblical contradictions, there are too many to be named here. If you are truly interested in learning about this, read the book The Greatest Show on Earth, The Evidence for Evolution by Richard Dawkins. Also recommended are Undeniable, Evolution and the Science of Creation by Bill Nye, along with Evolution for Dummies. Each of these will do a much better job of explaining than I ever can. This, along with mountains of evidence, prove the theory of evolution to be absolutely true.
Anybody who thinks that the world is less than 10,000 years old, there's an enormous number of creationists, especially in America, but not only in America, do think. The best excuse for them is lamentable ignorance. Ignorance is no crime, but it's something to be remedied by education. Anybody who is not ignorant, anybody who's been shown the facts and still believes the world is less than 10,000 years old, there's got to be something wrong with them. To give an idea of the magnitude of the error, to believe that the world is less than 10,000 years old, given that we know the world is actually 4.6 billion years old, it's equivalent to believing that the width of North America, right across from New York to San Francisco, is less than 10 yards. And that's the scale of the error we're talking about. So you've either got to be staggeringly ignorant, which most of them are, or if you're not ignorant, you've got to be insane. I think that religious upbringing is immensely powerful, and if it's hammered into you as a young child, it can be really quite difficult to get rid of in later life, especially if, when you were a child, you were told the devil will come and will try to persuade you of error, remain steadfast, don't listen. Sometimes they were even told things like, don't believe when people bring something they call evidence. Faith is more important than evidence. I mean, it's really a really appalling stranglehold that these archaic beliefs have on minds that have been warped since childhood. It's such a privilege to understand where we come from, a privilege that's granted to those of us who live after 1859, that to deny children that privilege is wicked. It's a deprivation which should not be visited on any child when the truth is so staggeringly exciting. It really is an enormously exciting thought that we are cousins of all living creatures, that we have a history of 4 billion years of slow, gradual evolution. Just think about 4 billion years of slow, gradual history. That's not something we can easily take on board. But the effort of doing so is well worth it. It's such a beautiful thought that we are the heirs of 4 billion years of maybe 3.5 billion years of evolution, and that we are cousins of all living things. When you put that against the measly, piddling little ideas that are in Genesis, it's just no comparison, and it's a sad and diminishing deprivation of a child's opportunities to be denied that knowledge.
I've always liked this quote. Ignorance is not to say stupid. Ignorance is exactly what I was when I denied evolution and science originally. You can grow out of ignorance. It is not something inherent in a person forever unless you choose to live in it. But the real reason evolution is such a big deal to religions and scientists alike is the implications of it being true. What it implies is that we started from microbial life nearly 4.1 billion years ago, evolved through natural selection, and became a sentient being capable of pondering its own existence. This is not to say we are not special, but there is nothing inherently special about us, besides that we are the elites along a long lineage of elites to have survived the process of evolution. We also seem to be the most intelligent. This is something I am thankful for every day of my life. I am thankful that my mind is nurtured sufficiently through billions of years to create who I am today. But what makes this destructive to religion is the creation story and how it falls apart. That does not just mean the creation story is a myth. It means that there was no reason for us to have ever fallen into original sin. We had to have been created in a garden, eaten an apple from a talking snake, and been cast out by angels with flaming swords to have ever been in need of a redeemer in Jesus Christ. This was the final straw for me. Christianity as a whole was shattered. I was not just not a Christian, I was not even sure I was religious at all. Some will still cling to their faith, claiming that God could have made us sinful from the start and therefore needed a redeemer. But this is entirely pointless. God either made us flawed intentionally or he didn't. Why would he make us sinful? This is evil at its finest. With such little evidence to go off, one might as well believe any religion in their claims. I had to examine what I had held on to earlier: love and morality.
It is no accident that we see green almost wherever we look. It is no accident that we find ourselves perched on one tiny twig in the midst of a blossoming and flourishing tree of life. No accident that we are surrounded by millions of other species, eating, growing, rotting, swimming. Without green plants to outnumber us at least 10 to 1, there would be no energy to power us. Without the ever-escalating arms races between predators and prey, parasites and hosts, without Darwin's war of nature, without his famine and death, there would be no nervous system capable of seeing anything at all, let alone of appreciating and understanding it. And it is no accident, but the direct consequence of evolution by non-random natural selection, the only game in town, the greatest show on earth. Theirs not to make reply, theirs not to reason why, theirs but to do and die.
Not scorning the three delightful children who result, who are everything to me and who are my only chance of even a glimpse of a second life, let alone an immortal one. And I'll tell you something, if I was told to sacrifice them to prove my devotion to God, if I was told to do what all monotheists are told to do, and admire the man who said, yes, I'll gut my kid to show my love of God, I'd say, no, fuck you.
Even with everything gone that I once believed, I was hanging on to the last thread of hope that goodness, compassion, love, and morality had to have come from something better than us. Even though the Bible and all religions were inherently wrong, even though the logic against God was near complete, I was still holding out, calling myself an atheist. I was agnostic. I don't necessarily use these words as others do, so I will attempt to give a quick definition. A theist is someone who both claims to know a God exists and believes. An agnostic, in my definition, is someone who is on the fence about God. They do not know if it is possible to ever pick a side. An atheist is someone who has picked a side. It is very rare to find an atheist who claims to know there is no God. In most cases, atheists are technically agnostic atheists. They actively believe there is no God, at least any we, humanity, are aware of, but they don't know for sure.
There are many people who call themselves agnostic, and I want to clarify this. It's rather a confusing term. I put up here a scale of religiosity from 1 to 7, where 1 is, I know there is a God, and 7 is, I know there is no God, and we've got a scale of intermediate agnostic positions in between. 4 is exactly 50%. Number 4, agnostic, believes that the probability of God existing and not existing is exactly equal. Number 2 is, I don't exactly know there's a God, but I have a very high probability, I believe in a very high probability of there being a God. I'm a de facto theist. I can't know for certain, but I strongly believe in God and live my life on the assumption that he's there. A number 6, at the other end, is somebody who believes there's a very low probability of God existing, but still not quite 0. I'm a de facto atheist. I can't know for certain, but I think God is very improbable, and I live my life on the assumption that he isn't there. I'm a number 6. I'm an agnostic, but with the same level of belief in God as I have belief in fairies or unicorns. Bertrand Russell illustrated this with his parable of the celestial teapot. He pointed out that it is impossible to disprove the hypothesis that there is a china teapot in orbit around Earth, or around the Sun, between the orbits of Earth and Mars. We therefore all have to be agnostic about the teapot theory, but in practice we are all a-teapotists. I want to make it clear that the agnostic position does not, should not, be confused with an exact 50-50 probability position. There are people who quite wrongly and illogically say, you can neither prove nor disprove the existence of God, therefore there's an exactly 50% probability of God existing. It's like tossing a penny. That, of course, is completely illogical.
Just because you cannot disprove something, and the teapot example shows that, it doesn't mean the odds of it being there are 50%, and you can quickly see that with the example of the teapot. I regard the hypothesis of the existence of God as a scientific hypothesis. And in this I disagree with many of my scientific colleagues who feel that science and religion have absolutely nothing to do with each other, and you can be a perfectly good scientist while your religious belief is a purely private matter that has nothing whatever to do with your science. I think that's wrong, because a universe with a God would be a completely different kind of universe from one without, and the difference would be a scientific difference. God, by the way, could clinch the matter in a heartbeat in his favor if he chose to intervene, for example, at this very moment.
Atheists have simply chosen the side that makes more sense to be on. I first wanted to look at something that our culture talks about as being sweet and innocent: human babies. If morality is going to be something divinely given, it must be inherent in the beings themselves. As a child, we must separate ourselves from animals in a moral sense. The reality is that babies are extremely self-centered. They believe the world revolves around them. They do not share, they have no sympathy, they lack all empathy. If these traits were used to describe me, you would think I was a monster. This is not the case, though. I share well, I love people unconditionally. I have even been known to help the homeless. Yet I wasn't born this way. Was it my religion that made me a good person? Even this doesn't work. There are plenty of religious people who do horrible things. To quote Steven Weinberg, "Religion is an insult to human dignity. With or without it, you would have good people doing good things, and evil people doing evil things. But for good people to do evil things, that takes religion." Unquote. This seems to be the case across the board. Religion doesn't seem to make people inherently better. If anything, it seems to allow them the mental gymnastics required to assimilate their evil. So it can't be religion that makes people better. What could it be then? It turns out that evolution has an answer for this. Chimpanzees are incredibly territorial. They live in communities of males, females, and children. They will routinely send males and occasionally infertile females on patrols around their territory. They will protect water sources as well. Imagine a scenario where there are two chimp territories. They both overlap at a shared water source for drinking. In the current behavior, we would expect chimps to fight and to kill over this source. This would ultimately mean the removal of one of the tribes by force and domination of the water by the others. This could result in the death of an entire tribe if they cannot find more water. They were ruled by brute strength and not by logic. A human, on the other hand, tends to resort to compromise. Why do we do this? Evolution would explain that millions of years ago, certain ancestors of ours were born more predisposed to peace and compromise. This helped them to survive over their territorial counterparts. The human tribe would be able to share the water source with the other tribe as long as conditions were met. This allows for human survival in both tribes and an increased gene pool. The humans may have even mated between tribes and worked together to survive. This is what separates us from other animals. We are not a separate being. We are animals. Yet we have an ability to reason due to our large brains. This seems to be very rare in animals in general, but it would seem that certain species are heading down the same path as us. Dolphins, bonobos, etc. It would seem that empathy and compassion are not traits we are born with. Some of us are more predisposed than others, but regardless of your ability to have it stick, so to say, we are all taught these skills. It is evolutionarily advantageous for us to work together to solve problems. Therefore, these traits are not divinely inspired. They are evolutionary traits, just as a claw or a long tooth is. I next wanted to understand the historical trends of religion and society. How is it that all of the bad things that have been done in the name of religion could have been justified? How is it that it took an extremely long time in the US until slavery was illegal? How is it that it took forever to allow women the right to vote? How is it that it took forever to allow homosexual rights? The answer had been staring down at me the whole time.
Do your worst! I dare you! Try to stop us!
Religion is the main reason for social progress to be slowed. This is not to discount the political fights that all of these issues will face. This is simply stating that the reason a lot of these things were permitted, or as I've said above, mental gymnastics, was due to a dogmatic doctrine. This concept is ridiculous. What I mean to say is, faith is the issue. Faith is the problem. The vast majority, if not all, of religious people will say that that statement is offensive. They fail to see my reasoning. Faith, by definition, is the voluntary shutting off of your reasoning skills. It is belief in something where there is zero evidence. Scientists do not have faith in evolution the way a religious person does in Jesus. Scientists have evidence that supports their claims. This evidence is peer-reviewed and tested against multiple disciplines of science until the theory becomes proven true to such an extent that to disbelieve it is downright insanity. Religion is precisely the opposite. To quote Bill Maher,
Finally, new rule, until someone claims to see Christopher Hitchens' face in a tree stump, idiots must stop claiming that atheism is a religion. There's one little difference. Religion is defined as the belief in and worship of a superhuman controlling power, and atheism is precisely not that. Got it? Atheism is a religion like abstinence is a sex position.
faith has always been the problem. To have faith in something means you have nothing to back yourself on, and you are giving a belief in Santa Claus the same validity. I realize that God doesn't change with the time. We change God. At the time of slavery, there were many verses pointing to the authority of a supreme being that supported human slavery. Once slavery was abolished, we changed the meanings of those verses collectively. The same goes for women's rights. Verses in the Bible very explicitly say that women have no authority over men, yet once this changed, we changed the meaning. Race mixing had the same process. Homosexual rights are currently going through the same process. Religion is not the supreme authority on morality. The people are. We change our perception of God's morals as our society evolves. It has been this way since the beginning of time, and I personally don't see this changing anytime soon. Human beings have a right to pursue their own version of happiness, so long as it doesn't infringe on others' rights. We are gifted with higher levels of intelligence than any other animals. We have evolving morals. All of these things are good. We as a species can make this world a better place, but this is being hindered with religions. There is so much money to be had by a belief in God that to say that we can ever end it is naive. We will always have people who profiteer off the suffering of others, but those of us who want to change the system don't stand a chance of being elected to office, at least not in America. An open atheist has never been elected to president. Very rarely will a political official of any rank out themselves as an atheist. This is statistically false. Out of any random sample of people that large, you would find people who identify as atheist, yet they claim not to. This is simply for political reasons, of course, but this means that the only people we elect to office are those who are okay lying to us. To quote Richard Dawkins once again,
So we've reached a truly remarkable situation, a grotesque mismatch between the American intelligentsia and the American electorate. A philosophical opinion about the nature of the universe, which is held by the vast majority of top American scientists, and probably the majority of the intelligentsia generally, is so abhorrent to the American electorate that no candidate for popular election dare affirm it in public. If I'm right, this means that high office in the greatest country in the world is barred to the very people best qualified to hold it, the intelligentsia, unless they're prepared to lie about their beliefs. To put it bluntly, American political opportunities are heavily loaded against those who are simultaneously intelligent and honest.
just as when I was a child with my non-belief in Santa Claus, I knew that God couldn't exist. It made no sense stacked up against every rational argument. The Bible is demonstrably false and full of flaws and contradictions. Science gave humanity a new way to view reality. It taught us that faith is not something to be praised. Evidence was the substitution. It rejected authority and traditions. Yet to me, I felt as bad as I ever had. I had no idea where to turn from here. I started my search with the purest of intentions. I wanted to know more about God. In the process, I discovered that religion is not only incorrect but evil. It is unnecessary and allows good people to do bad things. I was destroyed. A deep depression began to sink in. I had lost so much of my identity with this, and I was afraid. I was afraid now because I knew that my own mortality was now all too clear. I had one life to live. There was nothing more after this. There was no heaven. There was no hell. There was only this life. I was terrified at this realization that every heartbeat, every blink of my eye was drawing me closer to the void. I was scared of loss. I love my fiancée more than words could ever say, yet I knew I would never see her again once I died. I love my family. I love my grandparents. I knew that when I see my grandparent lying in a hospital bed, this would be the last time that I ever see them. I became so disconnected with reality that sometimes I would become physically sick. Religion had kept my feet firmly planted on the ground. Now I realize there was no ground at all. As much as I wanted this to be true, I couldn't. I discovered too much. God was not dead, because he never was. God doesn't exist. My bell no longer rang. As most depressions do, mine began to lift. I realized now it was not as simple as saying I was depressed. My consciousness had been lifted. The very nature of reality had been changed for me. It was akin to a sort of future shock. Once the initial depression left me, I was able to really sit down and integrate what I had learned into my reality. I realized that there was most likely no God at all, and almost certainly any religions today were wrong. Where was I to go from here? I began to realize that with this realization of my own fragility, I held things to be more precious. I realized that if I were to have a heart attack because of a bad diet, that was it. If I were to die because I drove home drunk, that was it. Religion teaches you that as long as you obey their rules, once you die, you move to paradise. This was no longer the case for me. I wanted to maximize the life I would have on Earth more than in just the length. I wanted to truly change my life for the better. I had not lost any sense of wonder. In fact, I found it. People will inevitably ask me why I wrote this essay. They will assume I am angry and wanted to change people's minds. It is true that I'm angry at organized religions, but I only wish to change other people's minds so they can experience the beauty I now see every day. I now realize how much I would have lost had I kept the wool over my eyes. When someone asks me what these amazing things are that I feel, I will respond with this Neil deGrasse Tyson quote.
What is the most astounding fact you can share with us about the universe?
The most astounding fact.
The most astounding fact.
Is the knowledge that the atoms that comprise life on Earth, the atoms that make up the human body, are traceable to the crucibles that cooked light elements into heavy elements in their core under extreme temperatures and pressures. These stars, the high-mass ones among them, went unstable in their later years. They collapsed and then exploded, scattering their enriched guts across the galaxy. Guts made of carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, and all the fundamental ingredients of life itself. These ingredients become part of gas clouds that condense, collapse, form the next generation of solar systems, stars with orbiting planets. And those planets now have the ingredients for life itself. So that when I look up at the night sky, and I know that, yes, we are part of this universe, we are in this universe, but perhaps more important than both of those facts is that the universe is in us. When I reflect on that fact, I look up. Many people feel small because they're small and the universe is big, but I feel big because my atoms came from those stars. There's a level of connectivity. That's really what you want in life. You want to feel connected. You want to feel relevant. You want to feel like you're a participant in the goings-on of activities and events around you. That's precisely what we are, just by being alive.
I wish it were possible to describe to you the way I feel every day. The wonder and sheer magic of life has never been so real to me. I realize things now that I never would have dreamt about before. I am, for the first time in my life, truly embracing reality. I realize the importance of maintaining our home, the Earth. Many nights I would have bonfires on hilltops just to stare at the stars. I realize how evil wars are. I realize how ridiculous it is to believe the things I used to. I may appear on the outside to be angry. This couldn't be further from the truth. I want every living being to realize what I realize now. I know how egotistical it is to believe that we are the most important beings on Earth, yet alone the cosmos. If there is alien life in the universe, which there most likely is, I believe they view themselves in the same sense of superiority that we do. This is a natural and evolutionary tool for self-preservation. Yet it is religion that perpetuates it. Religion forces us back time and time again into ancient ways of thinking. One of the most important points to examine of the true religious mind is their lack of connection to their beliefs. What I mean to say is that when their beliefs are challenged, they give themselves up. When a religious person gets cancer, they don't seem to react with the emotions you would expect. If they truly believe they are going to heaven when they die, the news of their soon-to-be trip to paradise should be a welcome relief. This world, in their own words, is imperfect and full of suffering. Heaven, on the other hand, is perfection. They will literally be with their God. Why does this not come into play? Another interesting point is how God can be good all the time. Let me set up a scenario that will exhibit this the best.
This is Stephen. He's from a rough part of the city, but he manages to stay out of trouble. He's a good kid, a Christian, from a Christian family. But one day, unfortunately, he accidentally wore the wrong color in the wrong neighborhood. Every single bullet missed Stephen. Obviously, God saved his life. It's a miracle. God is good. Stephen was struck in several places, but the bullets missed all his major organs. It's a miracle. He's gonna make a full recovery. God saved him. God is good. Stephen has some lasting damage. His spinal cord was struck and he suffered some brain damage, but those wounds should have killed him. God saved his life, because God has more plans for Stephen. It's a miracle he's still alive. God is good. Stephen is in a better place now, a place where there's no violence and no pain. He's with God, and he'll be waiting for us up in heaven. He has been called home. God is good.
Another example I have to try to prove the disconnect with some believers is what I call the heroin test. If you are speaking to a religious person, ask them if they would want their son or daughter to try heroin. Undoubtedly, they'll say no, of course not. Now ask them whether they would allow their son or daughter to be an atheist. Some will say yes and some will say no. They may say yes for many reasons. They want to stay in contact with them and they do not want their non-belief to stop them from having a relationship with them. From a secular standpoint, this is great, but from a religious perspective, it is nonsense. A religious parent should rather have their sons and daughters die from an overdose due to a heroin habit than allow them to be an atheist. If a parent would organize an intervention and make their son or daughter attend to try to save their life, why is the soul put on a lower pedestal? If the religious truly believe, the idea that their children would become atheist is the worst possible outcome for their lives. At this point, it would have been better if they had never been born. It is so easy to automatically say that heroin is a horrible outcome. But if you look through the lens of the religiously minded, it is preferable to atheism. This means, as an atheist, I truly respect those who try all they can to convert me. They at least have conviction in their faith. They truly believe it. If you can, even for a moment, set aside your religious belief to have a relationship with someone, you are not a true believer. Period. Or, of course, you don't understand the Bible and how plainly it states that non-believers will go to hell. Raising your children as religious should be as easy of a decision as enrolling your children into school. I respect the 9/11 hijackers for one reason. They were true men of faith. And that, it must finally be acknowledged, is a terrible thing to be. As my journey continued from theist to atheist, I learned how vehemently I despised religion. It had kept me in the dark for so long. This establishment would have kept my head in the sand for the rest of my life. I felt deceived, I felt exploited. I realize now that religion suppresses free thought. I realized how evil it is to tell a child that if they don't believe what you do, that God will burn them in hell for all eternity. It is child abuse. Religion is the cause of so much suffering and war, but the real root of the problem is gullibility, social constructs, and free thinking. How to think, not what to think. I often am told how atheism is a new religion. I am told that I am as evangelical as my religious counterparts. This is not only intentionally misleading, it is completely wrong. Atheism, by definition, is the exact opposite of religious doctrine. Religious dogmatism is exactly what atheists are not a part of. To claim that atheists follow certain beliefs or have a doctrine is to be ignorant of atheism. Yes, most atheists believe in evolution. Yes, most atheists believe in general relativity. This doesn't mean this is a doctrine. It is precisely the opposite. This idea that I have crossed into a new religion is insulting because it doesn't take into account the reality of my rejection. I have rejected dogmatism. I have rejected suppression of free thought. I refuse to live in fear or to bow down to authority. No one owns me. I make my own version of morality, one that is based on compassion and empathy for others. I accept scientific inquiries into the nature of reality. This is atheism. I have become painfully aware of my own mortality. As an atheist, you realize that you only get one shot at life. There are no redos. Death is an ever-looming burden on the human consciousness. We are animals who are aware of our own mortality, and this terrifies us. I realize now that one of the biggest reasons I didn't want to give up my faith was due to the fear getting the best of me. I was terrified of non-existence and wanted something to hold on to. The cradle rocks above an abyss, and common sense tells us that our existence is but a brief crack of light between two eternities of darkness. Although the two are identical twins, man, as a rule, views the prenatal abyss with more calm than the one he is headed for, at some 4,500 heartbeats an hour. I don't want to leave the woman I love, the family I love, or my own mind. It is a sad reality that one day, all of the knowledge I have gained throughout my life, all of the connections I have made, will one day cease to exist. My body will become food for other animals and the cycle of life will continue without me. Yet I find consolation in the words of Mark Twain. I do not fear death. I had been dead for billions and billions of years before I was born, and had not suffered the slightest inconvenience from it. God was a crutch that I needed for most of my life. I do not need it now, however.
I'll paraphrase Thoreau here. Rather than love, than money, than faith, than fame, than fairness, give me truth.
As an atheist, I acknowledge that death is permanent. This is the unfortunate outcome of the reality of the universe and our own existence. Yet in a way, this view makes life more important, not less. Life most certainly has no inherent purpose other than to be lived. This does not mean that I derive no meaning from my life. Quite the opposite is true. I find nothing but purpose to my life now. The fact that I have a finite time of consciousness means that I must make the most of my condition. I am healthy, happy, young, and full of life, for the time being. I know that one day I will not be. This is why I get out of bed every morning. I realize now the silly tribal aspects of human life. I realize that money is a way to enslave us. I realize that politics divides us. I realize that religion controls us. All of these things stem from my Darwinian realization that we are nothing but nominally intelligent mammals. When I finally kick the bucket, that is all that will ever matter. I want nothing to do with normal society anymore. I want to experience as much love in this world as I can. I want to travel. I want to experience different cultures. I want to learn all that I can. I find it absolutely fascinating that I live in the age that I do. We as a species have walked on the moon, explored the bottom of the ocean, and cured diseases. I live in the most fascinating time in all of human experience. For perhaps 250,000 years, my ancestors walked the planet in search of answers to the questions of existence. Not much has changed since then. I still wander in search of answers. Yet today, more doors have been opened. Yet as they say, as knowledge increases, wonder deepens. We know much, yet on the grand scale of things we know nothing. I live in a time in which the advances of modern science in every field imaginable inevitably point to the conclusion that there is no deity responsible for my destiny or creation. We live in a godless universe. This does not provide a satisfying answer to me, though. Yet neither does the God hypothesis, for the reasons I have already explained. This simply means that we are one step closer to understanding the nature of reality. I count myself lucky to be in such a position. I am a member of a species of hairless talking apes, aboard an organic spaceship orbiting a gigantic hydrogen explosion suspended above the vastness of the void, circling a force so strong that not even light can escape, along with hundreds of other hydrogen explosions and rock balls. This collection circles a multitude of other collections known as a galactic supercluster. The very idea of this is mind-blowing.
The real problem is the reality of life is way too huge for most people to grasp, including me. Like, how about space? When does that shit ever come up? You ever think about, if you enjoyed any part of this show tonight, I would just like 1 extra minute of your time. When you get out of here, and you get out in the parking lot, just look up for 1 minute. Do you ever do that? I never even pay attention to space unless I'm high. And when I'm high, it's usually like, dude, has that shit always been there? How come that never comes up? Space is the most taken for granted thing ever. You know how crazy it is, and it's above you every day, and it never comes up. If we all lived underground or indoors, there was only one place in the whole world where you could see space, you know how popular that shit would be? Everybody would travel to see space. You would just stand there and hold hands and look up and go, wow! There's no ceiling, this is fucking incredible, it's mind-blowing! But instead, it's just there every day. You're like, oh, look, the Big Dipper. See that? Oh, it's cool. People travel to see the fucking Grand Canyon. Like, dude, you gotta go to the Grand Canyon, man. Dude, it changed my life, man. I stood out there and saw that canyon. It was so immense. I just realized, well, how small my role in the universe really is. Oh, really? Wow. Hey, how about all that shit? What the fuck are you talking about? Those aren't light bulbs, motherfucker. Those are huge nuclear explosions billions of miles away. And it goes on forever. Do you know what forever means? It means this whole universe of hundreds of billions of galaxies might just be a part of one atom. It's in the cell of the balls of one guy who lives in another universe. It's part of one atom that's a cell of a ball and a guy. And it goes on and on and on and on forever. And there's no fucking end. And you're looking at a ditch. You just drove 6 hours to look at a ditch. You're a fucking dummy. You can see the bottom. Why is that even interesting to you? Oh, yeah, you're small, it's big. Space is some fucking crazy shit.
It has been said that atheists have nothing to live for. This is absolutely false. We have nothing to die for. We have everything to live for. I am thankful for my experiences every day. My upbringing into a religion I later found out to be flawed taught me a very valuable lesson. My passion for the truth and my love of science will forever be some of my most important traits. I feel as if I have gotten a second chance at life, a rebirth. My time on this planet now means more to me than it ever has. I want to experience all of it that I can. I want to end the suffering of others. I want to learn all there is to know. I feel truly sorry for those who are still stuck in the societal rut of organized religion. I write this mainly for them. If you possess the courage to think for yourself, have a conversation with someone who has left the church. You will be amazed at all they have to say. I went into my journey pure. I had no intention of leaving the church. I am no longer the child who cried when he found out that Santa Claus doesn't exist. I am proud of who I am. I stand with reason. I stand with science. I stand with truth. I am Godless.
You're ready to wake up, you're going to wake up. And if you're not ready, you're going to stay pretending that you're just a little, poor little me. And since you're all here and engaged in this sort of inquiry and listening to this sort of lecture, I assume that you're all on the process of waking up. Or else you're teasing yourselves with some kind of flirtation with waking up, which you're not serious about. But I assume maybe you are, not serious but sincere, that you are ready to wake up. So then, when you're in the way of waking up and finding out who you really are, what you do is what the whole universe is doing at the place you call here and now. You are something the whole universe is doing in the same way that a wave is something that the whole ocean is doing. The real you is not a puppet which life pushes around. The real deep down you is the whole universe. So then, when you die, you're not going to have to put up with everlasting non-existence, because that's not an experience. A lot of people are afraid that when they die, they're going to be locked up in a dark room forever. And sort of undergo that. But one of the most interesting things in the world, this is a yoga, this is a way of realization. Try and imagine what it will be like to go to sleep and never wake up. Think about that. Children think about it. It's one of the great wonders of life. What will it be like to go to sleep and never wake up? And if you think long enough about that, something will happen to you. You will find out, among other things, that it'll pose the next question to you. What was it like to wake up after having never gone to sleep? That was when you were born. You see, you can't have an experience of nothing. Nature abhors a vacuum. So after you're dead, the only thing that can happen is the same experience, or the same sort of experience as when you were born. In other words, we all know very well that after people die, other people are born. And they're all you. Only you can only experience it one at a time. Everybody is I. You all know you are you. And wheresoever beings exist throughout all galaxies, it doesn't make any difference. You are all of them. And when they come into being, that's you coming into being. You know that very well. Only you don't have to remember the past. In the same way, you don't have to think about how you work your thyroid gland, or whatever else it is in your organism. You don't have to know how to shine the sun. You just do it. Like you breathe. Doesn't it really astonish you that you are this fantastically complex thing? And that you're doing all of this and you never had any education in how to do it?